So thank you for joining us for the GHE Global Homeschooling Conference. And on behalf of the Global Home Education Council, I'd like to welcome you to today's session, which is making the most out of political engagement in the African context, a practical workshop. So we're hoping for a lot of discussion on that. My name is Cordeiro, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. I'm the founder of Learn Free, an organization dedicated to ensuring everyone has access to education at as low a cost as possible everywhere on the African continent. GHEX is grateful to our sponsors, board members, and staff who have made this online global conference possible. Please visit our website and the conference website to learn more about the GHEX at ghex.world and to visit our sponsor links. As we come together online instead of as originally planned in the Philippines, because of the pandemic, our conference theme, Home Education, a Global Movement, a Global Solution, shows that in spite of these challenges, the global homeschooling community is reaching out to help improve educational opportunities for all children. GHEX has a mission to support homeschooling everywhere for everyone as a fundamental right, regardless of who or how they choose to do it. We believe that every family, parents, and children should be respected and protected to enjoy the benefits of homeschooling. GHEX has been working to connect, encourage, equip, and influence organization leaders, policymakers, and researchers who have had an interest in homeschooling or home education for 10 years. This is our 4th Global International Conference, and you can learn more about GHEX at www.ghex.world. I'm excited about a discussion today, making the most out of political engagement in the African context, and I want to thank our speakers. Today we have 6 speakers, a very distinguished panel, and each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes for their opening remarks, and then we will open the discussion for Q&A. You can chat to your fellow participants in the chat window, and you can send questions to the speakers using the Q&A function. This session is being recorded and will be available for future access. So let me introduce our speakers. Today we are joined by Liz Gitonga. Liz from the East African community of homeschoolers. Liz and her husband Patrice began homeschooling around 20 years ago, becoming one of the pioneer Kenyan homeschooling families. She's a founder of Veritas Education Africa, which advances the pursuit of truth and virtue and education. And as I mentioned, Liz is a part of the steering committee member of the East African community of homeschoolers, an organization that networks homeschoolers in the region. She also serves on the advisory board of the Global Home Education Exchange, and Liz holds a master's degree in education philosophy, not home education philosophy yet, Liz. So welcome. I'm going to introduce all of the people, and then I'm going to choose all of our speakers, and then we'll just we'll have just a brief. I'll mention you as we go in between each of the sessions. We also joined by Bouwe and Eems. Bouwe and his wife Debbie have been educating their 5 children at home from 2000 onwards. In 2016, Bouwe became chairman of the Pestalozzi Trust, and in 2011, he and his family established an online platform, SouthAfricanHomeschoolers.org, which is the leading home education platform in South Africa, and actually has information on the African continent on it, on some of its pages. So please feel free to go there. He is also French. He's also a French horn player. We won't ask him to play today, and his children play in the Belleville High School Symphonic Min Band with him. We also Godfrey, who's helped me to. I've got to find where I wrote out Godfrey's name, the pronunciation of Godfrey's name, but Godfrey Kyazze, Kyazze is came to home education through studying the Bible to understand the biblical perspective of education, and he became convicted to homeschool his children. He is a curriculum writer, trainer, and speaker on matters of biblical worldview, education, economics, family, and governance, and all from a distinctly Christian point of view. Godfrey decided to launch the Masters Institute of Education, MIE, as a platform for a new university now under construction on a 13-acre piece of land. MIE has the vision to offer degree programs in education, political science, and business from a biblical worldview. And Godfrey is joining us today from Uganda. We're also joined by Canute Waswa. He's a homeschooling father of 3. Despite studying economics in university, which he denies from time to time when we have discussions, his early career followed a passion for nature, providing enriching outdoor activities to fellow students through the President's Award Scheme. He progressed from there to work for Outboard Bound in Kenya, Bermuda, and Canada. And on return to Kenya, he established Outdoors Africa, a management and training consultancy with a proven track record and established reputation that specializes in performance management. He is also part of the steering committee of the East African Community of Homeschoolers and part of the African homeschooling think tank of the Global Home Education Exchange. And Canute and his wife are eclectic, with their children, are eclectic homeschoolers. Mari Kuhlmann is from Namibia. She lives in Windhoek, the capital, where both her husbands were born and raised. And they lived for some time in South Africa, perhaps where the homeschooling bug bit, and moved back to Namibia in 2016. Mari is working to create a Kenyan home education homeschooling, the first association for homeschooling in Namibia. And the children who are now alumni or graduated from homeschooling, or let's say the secondary part of homeschooling, are pursuing a career in the performing arts. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Shirley Erwee. Shirley is a homeschooling mother of 6 children with over 20 years of homeschooling experience and still counting. She is a home education activist as well as a curriculum provider, offering various literature-based learning materials for South African homeschoolers, including the very well-known Footprints for Our Land program. And she also runs online GED prep to support homeschoolers who write the GED test as an alternative to high school exit examinations. She serves on a team of South African media ambassadors who advocate for home education with the general public. And she's a founding member of the Liberty in Learning Coalition, which we're looking to hear more about, which has been established to work for greater freedom in education in South Africa. So without further ado, let me hand over to Liz, who's going to be our first speaker. Liz, in fact, I have to give a few opening remarks before I hand over to Liz. So in terms of today's discussion, I'm going to just set a fairly broad outline, and then our speakers will give their individual perspectives and aspects of it and on their own thoughts. I've been warned by Shirley not to use too many acronyms, so I won't. So essentially, I'm going to speak about a couple of issues that that impact and set the African context. The one is something we discussed last night in one of our sessions, which was the trend towards globalization in education, which is actually now to some extent receding. And the idea really behind a lot of that trend was to create a highly articulated system of interdependent education where one could start studying for, say, for example, in University of the United States. We'll just use the higher education example here. Then, and if you were looking perhaps to get a technology degree, you'd have done some pre-work, you perhaps worked in industry, and your learning would be accredited when you went into that university. You could then come to South Africa after doing a couple of semesters in America and come to South African university. Then perhaps you'd go to India and work in their Silicon Valley in Bangalore. And then once again, the work you've done there would be accredited, and you could perhaps return to something like like Caltech to complete your degree. And all of that would be highly articulated and accredited. And it'd be kind of seamless transition between those. I think we're all aware that particularly in the developing world that hasn't happened, and that we're looking at a lot of repetition and work that and rework and many challenges in terms of how the system articulates. So we are seeing that aspect of global education receding, but it has left us the legacy of very powerful regulatory and particularly standard setting bodies, which we could maybe discuss to some degree as we go through our discussions. Then another two linked issues are the Millennium Development Goals, which looked at, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals had a major impact in developing countries because it looked at establishing universal primary education. But that had the impact of bringing increasing the number of students, but not necessarily the quality of education that was being received. And in some countries like South Africa, possibly even had a negative impact on the quality of education as student numbers in classes went up very quickly, which was one of the things that fueled the home education movement. And now with the goal of 2030, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, where the focus is going to be on quality and inclusive education. Whether those goals are going to be achievable has been, perhaps a spanner has been thrown in the works with COVID-19 and the perspective, particularly in developing countries, of school dropout as economic circumstances impact families. We're also then going to talk, and then we'll also discuss to some extent the issue of having a broader focus and looking at how the home education, particularly in the developing world context, interacts with broader issues of school choice and low-fee independent schooling. Because in the developing world, we have a much perhaps closer continuum between all of these modalities as people move in and out of those different forms of education. So without much further ado, let me then now introduce Liz, who and thank you very much for your comment. And thank you, Liz. We wait for your comments.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and really excited and glad to be in this very good, distinguished panel of distinguished people. Really happy to be part of this, and as we think around political engagement in Africa and how can we maximize that, and many of us will be just sharing different things in that regard. But you know, as you introduced me and made the error of saying that I have a master's in home education philosophy. And you know, actually that kind of reflects to my homeschool journey, because though I do have the 2 degrees in education, it has been through homeschooling that have really broadened my vision on education and had the opportunity to even interrogate the education philosophies and the various reasons why we do what we do, why education is defined in certain ways in various contexts. And that has really made me who I am today, just you know, a pursuit of education excellence, pursuit of truth in education, and hope to pass this on to our children and generations to come. So just a bit about Kenya. Kenya is in the eastern part of Africa. I think many of us would be familiar with that, but you may not know that it is right at the equator, and therefore we have really temperate climate, really beautiful. Reminds me of, if you've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the witch has made Narnia, has cast a spell on Narnia so that it's always winter and never Christmas. And Canute, you will agree, Kenya is always Christmas. You know, the weather is great, temperate, and just fantastic. And Godfrey, I'm sure you get to share some of that sentiment too. So you are definitely welcome anytime you are in Kenya. Would love to host you here. But looking further into just what are some realities in Kenya with regard to education, not just Kenya. I think as I reflect in Kenya, you see this reflected in Africa, and some of them may even be more specific to sub-Saharan Africa. Looking at our constitution does give the right to free and compulsory basic education for every child. And it also recognizes that a child's best interests are of paramount importance in every matter concerning the child. So that is specific to Kenya. But as Christopher, you have mentioned the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, you'll find that many countries in Africa, as indeed around the world, you know, have ratified as signatories to the SDGs. And therefore, our government policies are very much guided by these goals and very much aligned to this vision for global harmony and peace and thriving. And specifically, SDG number 4 is what focuses on education, and it says to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And listening to that, doesn't that sound like a home education statement of being? You know, this is what we are pursuing. We want, especially the last part, lifelong learning opportunities. I think that's a term I've heard over and over in homeschool context. People, families aspiring that their children would have a love for learning, would be lifelong learners. So this is stipulated, this is also reflected in the SDG 4, but you know, going further to say inclusive and equitable, which I think we would no doubt agree that in our families, the education we offer is inclusive and equitable. We don't educate the girls and leave out the boys. We model what is right for society. We don't educate those only of a certain age and leave out the others, because indeed we do recognize that education begins right from the time the child is born, and really actually I dare say from conception. So I want us just to very quickly look at 3 global trends, and these are not the only trends, but they kind of speak to what we are seeing in our society, what we see coming out in government policy regarding education, and looking at this as points of engagement with our government. The first trend that I look at is with regard to curriculum. I think we can all relate to this no matter what part of the world we are coming from. There are statements that we are hearing a lot. We are hearing about preparing children who are future ready. We are hearing about preparing children for careers that they will not, that do not exist today. So, you know, we kind of have to imagine that and prepare them today for a career that doesn't exist. We're hearing about preparing children for 21st century skills. And so when we look at those, that is kind of driving the global narrative of education. And I think an entry point for us as homeschoolers is looking at what are some of those foundational skills, knowledge that children need, even as we are thinking of the future. If you asked any educator or parents today, or even your cabinet secretary for education, what kind of person would you like produced in Kenya, for example, in 20 years? What kind of citizen are we looking for? And you'll definitely hear things like well-educated, which is a bit vague, but you want somebody who is innovative. You probably want somebody who is of good character. I know corruption is a big bane in our society, and so we want people who can kill that devil of corruption. And so we realize that some of these things that we desire to see in our citizenry are things that we all agree on, and which actually would be the bedrock of all these other 21st century skills. Things to do with the fundamental foundational skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. We want every child to know how to read, how to write, and how to do math, and have mathematical reasoning. We want every child, secondly, to be able to research and apply logic, think clearly, and apply themselves in life with the knowledge that they have gathered, to have a solid knowledge base. And thirdly, we want children who have character. Character issues are very paramount, so we do want a moral framework for these children. And those are things that we are offering and providing on a small scale in our homes, one family at a time. And a model which, when embraced, would actually lead to an transformation in our societies. So that's one of the global trends in curriculum. The other global trend is to do with school enrollment. We're seeing a push to, and sometimes a pull factor too, to earlier and earlier school enrollment. Mothers are increasingly now going out into the workspace and therefore needing somebody to look after their children. That's kind of the demand factor. But also there is a lot of emphasis by governments. Let's get the children into school. And actually under the SDG goal 4, one of the strategic goals is pre-primary education 100% enrollment in pre-primary education for the purpose of getting children ready for primary school. And when we think through the homeschool kind of environment where we are educating our children at home, I don't think there is a significant danger of a child not being ready to learn, because we recognize and we state as home educators, education begins at birth, or as I said, even at conception, because the child is in that environment. And right from the time the child is born, when I think back to when we were raising our children and they were younger, what would my 2-year-old be doing when I'm washing clothes? She'd be right there beside me at 2-3 years old, washing her little handkerchief, right? When I'm using the pegs, she'd be there also playing with the pegs. Now, educators will tell us that is the fine muscle development. A mother in rural Kenya will not know that, but the child is there engaged. Or she'll be chasing after the cat, or she'll be there asking a million questions, or looking up into the sky and imagining all sorts of things. You know, there is natural, organic learning happening right there. Lots of brain stimulation, which is what we emphasize in early childhood development, that the child needs stimulation. And a child brought up in a loving home will be well stimulated, well ready for formal education, which of course as home educators, we will continue in the home, you know, systematically integrating more formal learning as the child matures and is able to sit still for more formal kind of instruction. So curriculum being one of the global trends, early school enrollment being one of the global trends also. And the third one that I want to highlight is digitization, which again, of course, even with Corona has been brought to the fore a lot more. Just seeing digitization of education resources, digitization of communication as is happening now. And you know, it is amazing because that allows us to access every child everywhere at any time can access world-class education, whatever we would define that to be. They can access quality education, they can learn from the best teachers and are not, there's no barrier that has otherwise been created by the fact that you are from an area where there isn't enough provision of education resources. So that actually breaks down those barriers. And even in home education context, we will have our children learning. I think our friend from Mexico or somebody was sharing in yesterday's plenary session how they had their child, it was the man from World Vision, where they have their child studying Spanish from Guatemala, you know, but you're in the US, and that can happen everywhere around. But more so if we think about universal education. In the 16th century, the reformers brought about the idea of universal education, so that education is not just for the rich, but is for everybody and every child to be able to read the scriptures that will guide them even into living life and exploiting their potential. Now that must have been a hard task because you're talking about face-to-face education. Right now, we can actually dream of universal education through digitization. And therefore, as homeschoolers, our entry point is that we no longer have to rely on the inadequate government facilities. We can have models where there is no strain on government resources to build schools. We will use the resources of the home, the resources of communities that are available for families around that communities, for example, churches, and children can come along there, along with their parents, and receive a world-class education for the resources, the lessons that they may not be able to give at home, under the mentorship of parents who love them, who care for them, and who are able to guide them in that education journey. So with those three, I would like to just take a break now as my opening remarks, as we digest that and see what are some of those global trends, and perhaps as we go into discussions, others will also bring out other global trends that we are seeing that can be entry points into political engagement in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz. Those were very thought-provoking initial comments, and I'm sure we're looking forward to discussing, having a very interactive discussion. And let me remind people to put their particularly if you've got questions for Liz, please put them into the Q&A and also chat with each other. So thank you very much for those comments, Liz. But I'm going to now hand over to Bouwe van der Eems, who is the chairperson of the Pestalozzi Trust. Bouwe is in Cape Town in South Africa. Bouwe, we're looking forward to your comments and to giving us something of we've had a bit of a global context. We've had from Liz something from, and something more about the South African context from you, Bouwe. Thank you. Let me hand over to you. I think you may want to share your screen, do you?
Thank you, Christopher. Yes, I want to share my screen. So I've got a presentation. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna, Christopher asked us to do a bit of a overview of South Africa, of our countries we represent. I will do that, but I'm first gonna do a bit of an overview of Africa. I'm gonna try to ask the question, what makes South Africa unique, and what things should we take into account when we think about policy, home education policy in Africa? And then I'll zoom into South Africa. So, okay, so I've asked the question, what makes Africa unique when compared to other continents? And I think the first thing I want to mention is that in Africa, we've got a diversity of forms of family, where in Europe and America, the nuclear family is more dominant. In Africa, the extended family plays a much more important role. So it is not strange that, let's say, a father and a mother leave the education of their children for the grandparents to do. And when we make regulations, we should take that into account, and that is in South Africa a problem, that the policy in South Africa is based on the nuclear family. And then also what we've got in Africa is the child-headed families, where parents have been passed away due to the HIV pandemic, and that causes child-headed families. Those are the type of things that should we take into account when doing a home education policy. And they're sort of illustrated also by the saying, it takes a village to raise a kid. So in Africa, education is seen as more of a communal thing than merely a parental responsibility. So that's the first thing I want to mention of what makes Africa unique. Secondly, fragile states. So fragile state is sort of the new term they use for failed states. So where in Europe and the USA and the USSR or Russia, the national state has got a lot of control over the population, that is much less the situation in Africa. So national states or central governments have got yet much less control over what happens in the country. And so I've got that map that you see on top. That is a sort of the index of fragile states. So you can see most African countries are red or orange, where United States and Western Europe is very much green. That means the national state is very much in control. So in Africa, there are a lot of, like the Central African Republic, for example, is dark red. Okay, so that means that a policy that might be terrible in a Western country might be quite okay in Africa, because the national state doesn't have the power or the means to actually enforce those policies. So those are when we evaluate policy, that is something we got to take into account. Thirdly, indigenous governments. So indigenous government structures are everywhere in the world, but they play still an important role in Africa, where you've got there are a number of types of indigenous government forms, like bands and tribes and kingdoms. So in South Africa, we've still got a king, King Zwelithini, and he has got a certain amount of power that he can wield to control things. So whereas we might have a very good policy of a national government, if you don't get the buy-in of local authorities, whoever that is, then the national policy might not be of a lot of use. So that is something you also got to take into account. Continuing with what makes Africa unique is Africa's got young and growing populations. In contrast with Asia and North America, Africa is fairly young. So if you look at that map at the top, the world map, you see the red countries are countries with a very positive population growth, a young population, with Niger being the country with the highest fertility rate. So in a speech yesterday, somebody from Russia said one of the selling points of home education is that it is good for the family and will encourage population growth, because Russia's got a problem with population growth. The population is declining. But that story is not going to work in Niger. They've got different problems there. So, but you can repackage that story saying, well, if you've got a growing population, you need an education system that's scalable. And the school system is not scalable, because before you can educate a child through a school, you must first build the building, establish infrastructure, train the teachers, and it takes decades before you can start educating children. Whereas home education utilizes the resources that are already available in society, and it's a scalable thing that can grow with the population. So we can repackage the demographic argument. Thirdly, South Africa is also a continent with a lot of poor economies. So in the map at the bottom, you can see the blue countries are the rich countries and the red countries are the poor countries. So you can see there's a lot of red countries in the African continent. If you were looking for education solutions, then it should be economically feasible. It should not require millions of dollars in order to educate children. We must find solutions that are affordable. And lastly, I just want to put this thing on the table. I'm by no means of an expert on this, is the concept of ancestor worship, which is it is something that's a global phenomenon, but in certain African countries, of course, Waswa said this is a Southern African perspective, not a East African perspective. Ancestor worship does play a dominant role, and I picked this up in the biography of a South African politician that that struggled with the unwillingness of the state to allow children to be adopted, or the inefficiency of whether, as the law allowed for adoption, the executive branch of government was very inefficient in an adoption. And when she investigated, she saw that the ancestor worship thoughts were behind the resistance to that. So I'm not an expert on this. I think I'm just putting it up here for discussion, that how does this thinking influence how people are thinking about education? I just mention a few comments here that some people say adoption is not Ubuntu. So yeah, that is so Ubuntu is contrasted to giving your children over to somebody else. The logo of the Department of Basic Education in South Africa says, children are our biggest asset. Children are a national asset. So that your children are is an asset of the state, just like the railways is perhaps. So those are some points of what things we should keep in mind when discussing regulation in Africa. Moving on, taking all these things into account, I'm just summarizing how a regulatory environment for Africa should look like. I think it should make provision for a diversity of forms that involves extended families and communities, is independent of the national state, independent of expensive infrastructure, and scalable to accommodate growing populations. So that's a summary of how I think regulation in Africa should be. Now, going back to South Africa. South Africa, before 1994, home education was banned in South Africa due to the activities of the Association for Home Education. It was legalized in the SA Schools Act in 1996, and since then it's grown exponentially. And we had our estimates that there were about 150,000 home learners at the beginning of 2019, and after the pandemic it's grown to about 300,000. So in South Africa, its gross home education has grown exponentially. Another thing of South Africa is the law requires home learners to register, but there's a high level of non-compliance to that because of the inability of the national state to enforce compliance. And due to the deterioration of the school system, home education and cottage schools, which is a different form, it has grown exponentially, and it's started to catch the attention of the government, and they're now busy with new laws, new regulations, and currently South Africa is at a crossroad. So how do we address this? Our strategy in South Africa is as follows. We engage with all branches of government, legislative, judicial, and executive branch of government. We engage with the media. So we've established a group called the Homeschool Ambassadors, a group of homeschool leaders that are able and willing to engage with government, with the media, sorry. And they've been very successful in out-mediating the government. We engage on a wide and a unified front, and that's what Shirley is going to talk about. There's lots of home education organizations, and we work together in a coalition. We want to engage with researchers. That is still new. We're trying to get it going. And we also don't want to be critical all the time. When we engage with government, we don't say, oh, this is bad, that is bad, but we also put a lot of work in developing a positive alternative to what government does. And we promote that. And lastly, we want to be prepared for the end game. So if we lose all our battles in our dealings with the legislators, and they come with draconian legislation, the end game is going to be a court case in the Constitutional Court. And yet we are busy, yet everything we do is always with that end goal in mind. And that is, I think, the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you very much, Christopher.
Thank you very much for those comments, Bouwe. I think it's going to be very interesting. I think you make a very interesting point about mobility and scalability, because in Africa, what we see a lot of, and particularly in South Africa, where we actually are one of the countries, as we saw from your slides, that has a lot more resources, is that we put a lot of those resources into physical schools. People move away from those areas. Those physical schools are then abandoned, and those resources are wasted. So I think it will be a very interesting discussion, not only about the fact that we have a growing population in Africa, but it's a moving population that moves from the rural to the urban areas and back again. So we've had quite a bit of discussion in terms of a scene setting. Bouwe has given us some practical steps of how South Africa how South Africa is engaged in political engagement. And I now have the pleasure of introducing Canute Waswa. Waswa Canute Waswa, the white termite that bites. Waswa is, as we said, serves on the board of each, and is joining us from Kenya. And Waswa, I'm going to hand it over to you. You're going to speak about frameworks and wireframes for political engagement. We're getting now into the really practical. We've had the overview. We're now getting into the really practical part of the workshop.
Yes. Thank you so much, Christopher and Bouwe. You have set a very nice platform for me to be able to take off. And I'll start by asking, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where we now have to get into political engagement? And the answer to that is this has been a 100-year journey, maybe longer for South Africa, but for us in Kenya and Uganda, we've been at this thing for 100 years. 1898, Imperial British East Africa Company comes to trade in Kenya. They build railways, Kenya-Uganda Railway, and I'm glad Kyazze is here. The intention for this railway was to get resources from Uganda to Mombasa to Europe. The same thing happened in Tanzania. The same thing happened in Ghana, in Nigeria, hinterland to Lagos, and even in South Africa. So by the time Kenya becomes a crown colony in 1920, we have a governor in Kenya who is ruling on behalf of the Queen. Now, this is important because down the road, you'll get to realize that when you get to political engagement, you have to see how this design was actually built not to facilitate what you're looking for as a homeschooler. And when Kenya became a crown colony, we had a colonial constitution from 1920 to 1963. Then, in 1963, Kenya becomes an independent state. We have our first black president, Jomo Kenyatta. What happened in 1963 is he became the prime minister, and so he got the powers of the governor. 1 year later, Kenya becomes a republic. The powers of the governor are amalgamated together with the powers of the queen. And oh boy, we end up with an imperial president. To date, 60 years later, we are still trying to unlock that system. Now, remember, as I said, just like physical infrastructure, the railways and the civil service and the judiciary, our educational system was never designed to give us good education. It was designed to create workers for the empire. In fact, it used to be called reading, writing, and arithmetic. So lots of rote learning so that you could become a good clerk for the colonialist. And my key point here is, right from its design, this educational system was designed for control. And that has fundamentally never changed. And that's why I said, we've been at this thing for 100 years. And just like Bouwe mentioned, when you talk about how government works, it's very interesting. We have political promises, we have how government works, and then we have realities on the ground. I'll give you a practical example. 2002, we had our elections. Kibaki became our president. He gave many political promises, and one of the key promises was free primary education, which started on 1st January 2003. We celebrated on the streets. We even had the oldest student to ever start grade 1 education called Kimani Maruge. He was 84. He went to the UN and addressed the General Assembly. I told them, guys, this thing is happening in Kenya. Millennium Development Goals, SDGs, voila, we are with it. Political promises. But you and I know how government works. Basic economic planning tells you when you have a youth bulge, you always plan and put up infrastructure for the future because a wave is coming. So either build a big wall or be ready to absorb that wave. So in 2003, according to government data, we had 1.1 million children coming out of the woodwork into the educational system. When you fast forward 12 years later, when this cohort was going into university, out of the 1.1 million children who joined the system, only 100,000 were going into universities, tertiary institutions, and colleges. Now, that's a classical example of how government works. You see, government is a bureaucracy. By the time you talk about government funding and taxation and Ministry of Education and Ministry of Planning and Infrastructure and where they will get money and how you need to get a policy to become a cabinet paper to be adopted, 5 years are gone and it's time for more political promises. So the next government came and promised us laptops. We are still waiting. But I'm just trying to tell you that when you look at political promises and how government works, the realities on the ground speak for themselves because numbers don't lie. And so back to what you are addressing in this session, when we are talking about making the best out of political engagement, remember that you are engaging a bureaucracy which was designed for control. But then that leaves us with a big question. So how do we go about it? What do we do now that we are here? And here is where I'm going to introduce you to something, a sport called judo. You see, in judo, you don't need to be very strong. What you need to do is to use the strength and the heaviness of the opponent to tackle them. And how do you do it? Because government is big. Oh, government is big. It's bigger than an elephant. In West Africa, there is a saying that says, a man who knows that his anus is small does not swallow an udala seed. Now, figure that out for yourself. But I'm just saying, when you're taking on this bureaucracy, the judo component means first, prepare yourself for the long play. And Bouwe mentioned that. And long play here basically means governments change. The state does not change. So you had de Klerk's government, you had Mandela's government, you had Mbeki's government. They will keep changing. Same for us. We had Moi and Kibaki, and now we have Uhuru. Governments come and go. The state does not change. So the Minister of Education will always change, but the state, which is the bureaucracy, that never changes. So for you to engage with this, it means you must prepare yourself for the long play. The second thing you must do is to understand the signs of the times. And the signs of the times is what Liz alluded to when she talked about the fourth industrial revolution. Everything is changing so fast. What worked and got us here will not get us there. It means even government does not understand the speed of this change. By the time they go through the bureaucracy of changing the policy, everything is changing exponentially. So rote learning will not work. What is going to work? It means understanding the signs of the times forces us to realize how can we take advantage of where the wind is blowing. Right now, our wind is COVID-19. Even government is looking for solutions. Regular education is out because schools are closed. What does this mean for us? It means we must see how do we capitalize on this to play judo. And finally, on the practical component, I would say, the way we used to say when we were scouts, always be prepared. And how must we be prepared? Number one, have some sort of registration. You know, whether you are a community-based organization or a company limited by guarantee or a trust, because government listens to systems. And so if you're registered with them, they will listen to you. So have some sort of registration, which we have done as each, and Kyazze has done, and you guys have done in South Africa. That is the first step. The next step in always being prepared is be the one to define the narrative. I'll give a very funny example. In Kenya, we had something called Bridge International Schools, which was working in the slums and the informal settlements. It was very political because they were using tablets. This data was sent to the US. But what was really happening is teachers in the bridge schools were teaching. These teachers were not trained. They were not paying union fees. They were nowhere near Liz, who is a master's degree holder in education. They were just, you know, grade 12 education, but they were teaching students in their villages. And these students were outperforming government-sponsored students in the regular school system. So when the government came making noise, we said, but we are doing your exams, we are doing your curriculum, and then say with a very small voice, but we are beating you. So the government was at odds. They couldn't deregister the school. They just said, these schools are American, we need to do something. The last I checked, the schools are still running. But just goes to my point of be the one to define the narrative. When you define the narrative, the government always gets there late and panting. And finally, relax. We've been at this for 100 years. It's a marathon, it's long play, so we'll be here for a while. So just relax, enjoy, and engage government. Thank you so much, Christopher. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Waswa. Everyone enjoys your energy and your enthusiasm when you speak. Yeah, and I think once again, thank you very much for those insightful comments and for those very practical comments and for that encouragement. We are now going to introduce Amari Kuhlmann from Namibia, and Mari is, as we said in our introduction, she is actually working on the creation of an association in Namibia that is at one of those organizations that perhaps not like EACH and the Pest Policy Trust in South Africa. It's really at the beginning of this journey, or taking its first steps in this journey. So Mari, we'd be very interested to hear from your perspective, and I'm sure like me, you've learned a lot from all of our panelists.
Yes, thank you so much. At this stage in Namibia, we have quite a new movement. So for the time being, in terms of home education, not as new, but the movement as such is quite new. So just for our international viewers, I just want to say that we are a neighboring country for South Africa. So you can see on that slide, we're on the southwestern part of Africa. We gained independence in 1990. Our population is about 2.5 million. And one of the things that makes us a very diverse country is the fact that, well, diverse is, amongst other things, but is the fact that we have only 3 people per square kilometer. So we have wide open spaces, and we love that about our country. And it makes our country a very unique place. So come visit us, okay? Anyway, that aside, home education has been legal since 1990, which was independence. So in other words, we were part of South Africa until then. And so, of course, all of those legal things applied for us. But in 1990, it was legal because we adopted the 1996 Schools Act at that stage, which changed in the meantime. But it's still illegal, and the basic things about that is still very vague, as most of these policies are. And it's been existing for our existing homeschool association is in process, and we are very excited about that. Estimate home education families at this stage is about 4,500, but that is not a formal number. We are looking into doing formal numbers soon, just, you know, for ourselves as well. And the current registered home education families, as per our Namibian newspaper in June 2020, was 1. So that's just to confirm the bureaucracy and the policy and the long play Waswa just spoke about. Yeah, that's just obvious. So if we continue then to look at the educational context, we are a developing country, but we have a lot of big hands, if I can put it like that, who's funding sustainable growth programs like USAID and Germany, and that's just amongst other. The problem with these countries or with these sustainable growth programs is it comes with its own set of bureaucracy. So now you've got government bureaucracy, and now you add to that some more bureaucracy and limitations if you look at it from my point of view. 52% of our country is actually urban and have access to good quality education, but the remaining 48% is rural and does not have access to proper instruction. State schools do not even have enough trained instructors, and that is one of our very biggest challenges at this stage. But I also think it's one of the opportunities we have as a home education movement to engage with government. Carefully though, but obviously that would be one of the things that we would address. Home education in Namibia actually existed since 1970. The movement has grown very solidly and quite rapidly over the last 3 years, but before that it was mainly for farmers, and the primary school years were on the farms with their parents, and then after that they would go to South Africa to hostels there and to complete their secondary schools. We have limited curriculum options, mainly due to misinformation and fear. So some of the curriculum providers stated that they are the only approved providers, and it caused fear because people thought they had to register with these providers in order for them to homeschool. And that was just creating a lot of misinformation. It's not the truth. I mean, today we know it's not so. The vast distances between the parents, especially for our rural community, is something to really take into account. Bouwe already spoke about that. So many times one parent will be in the primary education, involved in the primary education of a family, of the children of the family, but often they actually go to brothers or sisters in urban areas, or even cousins. So it wouldn't even be direct family. And this creates a different scenario. And sometimes, you know, when a parental role is stuck with too many children to care for, it just becomes an overwhelming task. And education doesn't always get the better option there. The role of our homeschool education association, in Namibia is to actually really just inform prospecting and existing parents of the myriad of options of curricula, and to offer support and resources, and just to make it an available, to position educational, to position home education as a place where people can come for an alternative. And at this stage, we are also looking at even engaging with people with special needs, because there is quite a big number of people with special needs in our country. I think it's got a lot to do with malnutrition. I'm still trying to find out more about that, but that's definitely something we also will look into. So for us, that's basically Namibia. It's a young and growing country, but also very exciting. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you, Maury. Thank you very much for that insight into the lovely country of Namibia, our neighbor. And of course, your population density is so low because you've got large desert areas there as well.
Yes, that's true.
So thank you very much. That's very interesting, and I think we're going to have a lot of. You raised the issue also of the different dynamics in Africa with rural and urban, and the different challenges, and perhaps an area that we certainly could discuss, and that I think is an area for future development, is how do we look at home education in a rural context? How can we use home education as a delivery vehicle for education in the rural context, particularly given, as Bouwe has mentioned, the very different nature of families and family structures and community-based education in Africa. So thank you very much for that, for those insights and for your thoughts. And we also wish Namibia all of the best as you develop along this path. Now we go from Namibia to a much more lush African country, Uganda. And by now I hope I've learned to pronounce Godfrey's name better. So I'm now going to hand over to Godfrey Kyazze, who is going to speak to us from the Ugandan perspective, and we will have no fighting about long distance runners and where they come from. Thank you, Waswa.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher, and everyone. And thank you for our organizers, the JECs, the board members, and all those people like Trudy who have helped us to coordinate all of this together. Yes, from a Ugandan perspective, I want to say that homeschooling is, yes, we can look at it like it's a growing movement. We do not have so many numbers yet. At least the engagement we've had for the last like 3 or so years, I could say they are still in hundreds. It would be presumptuous of us to say that we have thousands or 1,000 families that are homeschooling yet. But they are in hundreds, but they are growing, especially now with the pandemic. I keep telling people that when the pandemic came and there was a total lockdown on the nation, everyone was complaining about having nothing to do. And for homeschoolers, especially those of us who have availed ourselves to help others, it became a very, very busy time with calls, people making calls right and left. These Zoom meetings, we're making Zoom meetings every day. There is a lot that can show that actually there's a growing interest. If it was an issue that people do not know about this, there are many people that are getting to know about what is homeschooling, or at least they are inquiring, they are asking, they're interested in knowing what it is. Otherwise, in Uganda, if we talk about engaging with policies, like in Kenya, our constitution or our laws do not necessarily mention homeschooling as yet. And I say as yet because I think we are coming from a perspective that it is something that people did not know about. So there was no need of mentioning it because the idea, people didn't know that there are even people who are homeschooling. But I want to go straight to responding to the question that how do we as homeschoolers begin to engage with politicians in these circumstances where the laws do not necessarily mention us. At the same time, there are people who are doing it. And in Uganda, there are people who have done it, talking about Ugandans themselves. There are people who have done it for the last, I would say, 20 years. There are people who have been at it. Very few of them, but it has been there. These are people who came to learn about it from their friends from the West, especially missionaries that come to serve here in Uganda from America or from the UK. So they are Ugandans that got to learn about it and they have done it. I'm talking about families who have their children who have even graduated from universities and they are now working. I can mention like maybe 5 or 10 families that have been doing this for the last 20 years. But recently there is a growing number of families who are homeschooling, all of whom are below, whose children are below the age of 15 years. Those are the families that we are seeing who are getting involved within the context where the law does not necessarily mention it. So personally, when I get to think about what can be done with what we have done and the way we have been engaged and how we've been involved in this work, there are about 1, 2, 3, 4 ideas that I would love to put on table that I think we could focus on if we are to see ourselves engaging with politicians, especially to influence the policies in favor of home education. Number one, which we are doing, the organization I'm running, or I help to coordinate, which we call Homeschoolers Uganda Group. These are some of the things we are trying to do. One is to sensitize the masses, because we are coming from a context where whenever you meet somebody and they hear that you're homeschooling, they want to ask, what is this? Does it even happen here in Uganda? There are so many questions around that show that actually people are not even aware that homeschooling is an idea, it's an alternative to the education system that we have. Most of our people have been made to think that education is something that only belongs to the government. That if you do anything educational, it has to be licensed by the state. So if there is anything that sounds like it doesn't happen within what the state controls, people are not aware of it. So there is need for a lot of sensitization to sensitize our masses, especially if we are going to look at engaging politicians. Politicians are the kinds of people that listen to a critical mass. But at the moment, we do not, in Africa, we do not have a critical mass of homeschoolers that politicians can listen to in many of the African countries. So we need to make sure that we get as much converts as possible. And this will call for sensitization programs like EACH or Homeschoolers Uganda Group or the Pestalozzi Trust. I think one of the things we need to begin doing is to see how do we begin to engage with the population, especially the likely converts. Those of us who are doing, people homeschool for various reasons, but I've found it that there are so many who are doing it because of their Christian faith. And because of that, I think we have constituents there in the church that we can begin with to sensitize. In that, if we sensitize the church, where we have already people who can listen to us, and we get a critical mass from that population, we can get to a point where the politicians can begin to listen to us. But at the moment, especially in Uganda, you find that even the Christians in the churches where we go ourselves do not know about homeschooling, do not understand it. But that could be an opportunity for us to sensitize them. And after sensitizing those, we can even go to other groups that we have influence over and let them know about it. We can do this in various ways. We could organize face-to-face programs. During this pandemic, one of the things we've been doing is to organize these kinds of webinars and discuss with all kinds of people just to let them know that there's such an idea, there's such an alternative, this is how it works, this is where you can find resources. As people are sensitized, they get to appreciate and possibly begin to embrace the idea. But also we can use the media. We can use social media. We can go to the mainstream media platforms, which we've always had, like television and radio stations. We can write in papers about homeschooling, what we are doing, writing our experiences. As we get ourselves to be exposed out there to the population, I think we'll get a critical mass of converts, of people who believe in homeschooling. And that's when we can begin to engage with politicians, and they'll be able to listen to us because we're a critical mass. The second thing I think we need to look at is that after we've sensitized the population and we have this critical number of people who have heard about us, then we shall be able to get converts. But what do we do with these converts? We'll need to train them. We'll need to take them through some training so that they homeschool well. I remember yesterday in the plenary session with Mike Ferris was sharing, he mentioned 3 critical ideas that I would want to tag in here. That for people who are homeschooling, it is very good for us not to neglect academic excellence. So as people get to do homeschooling, we need to see how do we help them. Those of us who have been at it for a while, how do we help them to share with them our experience to make sure that as well they do it properly, so that their students or their children turn out to be those kinds of learners that can be reckoned on. So we need to train, we need to conduct trainings, or we need to put together some training programs that we can invite participants to, so people can get to know, how do I do it confidently, how do I do it properly, how do I do it convincingly, but as well, how do we get people who are convicted and convinced that this is the best thing to do? I think that will take some training. And then the third thing I think we may need to do as we engage politicians is to carry out research, to be deliberate at doing research. So we conduct evidence-based arguments in the media, but as well, if we are going to engage the politicians, they will love to listen to evidence. They will want to listen to studies, of which today, if you want to carry out research on homeschooling, especially in Africa, I've done a little bit of it in the past year or two, and I discovered that most of the resources I would rely on to study about homeschooling, they are written from the Western perspective, from America, from the UK, from Australia, but in Africa, we haven't done much studies on this subject. I think we don't need to neglect the aspect of research. It is something that we need to invest in to see that we carry out evidence-based research or studies in the African context, in our different countries, so that when the time comes for us to engage with a politician, we engage with them from an evidence point of view. And lastly, after we've done all of this, we've sensitized people, we have people who are trained, who are doing it, and they are doing it properly. And we have done our research, we have our papers in place, we have possibly published even some of them. They are appearing in some of the journals which are unknown. We have an opportunity that we can be able to engage now globally. We can network at a global level, at a continental level, and at regional levels like East Africa or Southern Africa. And we have some of these studies published in various fora. That way, we are able now to begin to mobilize the masses for advocacy, networking, and to lobby the legislators. I realize that most of our legislators, the laws they come up with, these are laws they come up with because they are being influenced by some other societies or by some other groups like the United Nations, the UNESCO. Many people here are referencing the SDGs and the Millennium Development Goals. Most of these goals, they are people who have stood behind them, and they are investing a lot of resources, and they are the people who come to our legislators trying to influence them to make sure that they come up with policies in the countries that are going to lead the country in the direction, sometimes even directions which ourselves as Africans or nationals are not the directions we want to go. But if we have our studies together, we'll be able to mobilize people and even lobby the legislators, our own legislators, and begin to advocate for some of these policies that we know that they will be favorable for the advancement of homeschooling and these kinds of things that we believe in. So I believe that these are things that we need to do, these 4 things: sensitize the masses so we can have a critical mass, train as much people, those who are already converted and they are attempting to homeschool, to put together some sort of training programs for these parents to make sure that they do well what they do, they learn from those of us who have been doing it so that we can learn from one another. Then we need to carry out research, and thereafter we need to mobilize resources in terms of money, but also in terms of personnel to lobby and advocate for favorable policies in our countries. This is how we'll be able, I think, to engage with politicians in our nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. Thank you. That was a very, thank you. And I think, yeah, to re-echo your 3 points, sensitize, train, research that you can bring evidence-based research to the table, and use that as a foundation for lobbying. And I can only underscore your point. I was just doing very late last night for a parliamentary meeting today, doing some analysis of our own research here in South Africa, school research. And it's just evident that we've done very little of that in the last 5 to 10 years. And we're very much relying, but when we engage the South African government, we constantly get told how much research they are doing. But essentially, we're just relying on UNESCO research, nothing that's contextualized within the African context. And that's something that we have to tackle on a very broad front, not just in the home education space. But thank you very much for those comments. You spoke extensively about, in this first role of sensitization, the role of the media. Our next speaker is Shirley Erwee. Shirley, as we know, has been involved in home education for 20 years. One of the leaders of home education in South Africa. Bouwe always tells me at the expos. In fact, I always get scheduled at the expos with Shirley on the other side, and then everyone goes off to Shirley's talk. So I'm in charge today, Shirley, for once. I don't have hundreds of people going to your talk and having to beg them to come to my talk on the boring old law. But Shirley's been very involved in media in South Africa in terms of the home education ambassadors, and she's now. And we also heard from Mari about an association that's starting up. But South Africa has a number of associations, and you're also working with an exciting initiative of a coalition, the Liberty in Learning Coalition. So without further ado, and let me not use up the time that my very well-timed presenters have kept to, I'm going to hand over to you, Shirley.
Thank you, Christopher. Yes, I'm going to talk about the Liberty in Learning Coalition, which was formed in South Africa only this year. Sorry, I'm just going to go, am I presenting? I'm going to go through what it is and why we formed the Liberty Learning Coalition in South Africa, and perhaps we can work together more widely with other African countries. We'll discuss that maybe. And I just thought I'd start with our history and then explain what we did and why we've done it. So
Shirley, we're not seeing slides. If you want to share slides, we're not seeing them.
Okay, right.
Unless someone else is seeing them and I'm not.
Oh gosh, I did. Okay, let me just.
I think just go with it. Go with the flow. No, wait, it's coming now. We've got it now.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if you're seeing it in the right format now, but anyway, I'll just carry on.
You'll just have to go to slideshow on your side.
Yeah. Okay, from current slide. There we go.
There we are. Brilliant. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So I'm going to start with a little bit before the coalition began in 2018. A bunch of us home education leaders were invited by Marty du Plessis to represent homeschooling at a Mighty Families Conference in Bloemfontein as a way to offer home education as an educational solution and to give families hope. And as we had time to get to know each other a little bit better, and we sat around and shared our own journeys as people who came through the school system and had to overcome things, or people who have been homeschooling our own children for some time, we just realized that actually everybody has their own testimony and everybody has something to share, and that we actually need to proactively become a voice for home education. And so that was where the idea of homeschool ambassadors was really born. And we started a little social media group where we could just text each other and be in communication with each other. And the idea was that we would form this team who would be available for interviews with the media or wherever it was necessary. Because in the past, they the media tended to always contact the same people, and it was always the same voices. And we just thought it would be great to show that we've actually got a wide base of competent people who can handle these grilling interviews with skeptical, media journalists and interviewers, and can give good answers to these questions that are just based on fallacies. And we can bust all the myths that are out there about home education. And no matter what town it is, whether it's a radio station in Cape Town or a TV station in Johannesburg, there would be someone almost everywhere who would be available to out-media, as Bouwe likes to say, or to outmaneuver the media and handle those kind of situations. And I'd always wished that we had more time at our national expos around the country to actually sit and get to know other experienced homeschoolers better, because I know that we all have wisdom and experience to pass on to each other and to other families who are at earlier stages of the journey than we are. And so then we had the idea to actually do this online using the media. And one of our team is now hosting regular interviews with seasoned homeschoolers and sharing them on YouTube in our online homeschool lounge. And that's been a great success. A lot of people have found a lot of value in that. And it ties up with the kind we mentioned. By doing this, it's really informal mentoring and training for younger homeschooling parents. So that's a very effective way that can be done at very little cost. The other thing we've done is handle these media interviews. And in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of interest in home education. And so we have had people, all around the country handle different interviews, and it's really been very effective. And people in South Africa do know about homeschooling. It's reached the mainstream. And so that's been quite an interesting shift. Then we've also engaged with the government and attended meetings with them about this proposed legislation, because, as you know, there's a saying that freedom is only one generation away, and we've got to guard it. And since 2017, we've had this Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill hanging over our heads. We call it the Bella Bill. And then in 2018, a new home education policy was introduced, which is problematic for various reasons. And so we know that we need to be prepared to engage with our Department of Basic Education. So in February this year, there was a meeting with some homeschooling stakeholders and the government. And some of those who attended came to the conclusion that at times it feels like the government is just going through a tick box exercise when it comes to consultation with home education stakeholders. And that there were quite a few voices there who are more in favor of complying with some of the regulations that many homeschoolers find problematic, and that it wasn't a very good representation of the diversity of our homeschool movement. And this is where the idea came about, to create, to have meetings with as many stakeholders as we could, and associations and parents and everybody involved, curriculum providers, so that before we engage with them, we've thrashed out the issues and formed a strategy and some mutually agreed upon things between ourselves that would be acceptable to everybody, or as many of the diverse stakeholders amongst us as we could. So we started meetings in March 2020. That's where it's kind of started for where we, and got to where we are today. And we invited provincial and national organizations, lots of special interest groups, parents, individuals, anybody who wanted to participate was welcome. And it was just when we went into the lockdown in March. And so everybody was very quickly getting used to using online media platforms for meetings. And we started holding these meetings every 2 weeks. So we now have over 30 member organizations and individuals. And we've worked hard to create a media presence with some nice branding on our website. We've got a social media group and a page on Facebook, so that people, just parents who aren't perhaps leaders, can also get involved and get behind the movement. And we've spent a lot of time discussing our goals and our strategy. And the goals are really just to work for greater freedom in the legislation and regulations in South Africa, rather than to promote compliance, which is what some other voices are doing. And we've also really worked hard at making sure that it's clear what we stand for, because we want to work with people who support our goals so that we can foster a climate of mutual trust amongst all of us, because we are very diverse. In South Africa, we've got different cultural groups, different language groups, people from different religious affiliations, different political affiliations, besides the variety of philosophical approaches to education that exist in the home education movement, well, that's global. So there's a lot of differences, and we've really had some interesting conversations around some of those issues. And then the strategy, really the overarching strategy, is to go for simplification of the legislation affecting home education. And we, as Bouwe said, we are not just criticizing what's existed and the proposed legislation, but we're trying to clearly articulate what the problems are and formulate solutions and alternatives, and an alternative regulatory framework that would be more acceptable to as many stakeholders as possible. And so we've planned to do that through representation and advocacy, and also encourage research and, as I say, promoting a relationship of trust between home educators and all the other stakeholders and government that are involved in the decisions that we have to be part of going forward. And so just to end off, a few suggestions for other countries is that I think it's very important as the movement grows to build a large competent team of leaders, so that you, like us, can have these voices, these ambassadors, so that there's continuity. So, I mean, let's say somebody is not available because of a personal crisis for 6 months. There needs to be other people who can just step into the gap and take that role. Also to represent the diversity and to make sure that wherever you are, that somebody is available for interviews. And then I think perhaps we can also just connect as leaders from different countries and support each other as well. So that's my talk, and now we can go to a more general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. So now two things have happened. I know why more people attend your talks than they attend mine, because of your ability to bring a lot of information across in a very concise way.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that for that presentation. And I think we're looking forward to our brothers and sisters in Africa and to everyone across the world joining us in more coalitions. One of the things we didn't perhaps speak a lot about is a trend towards African integration, and integration on the home education front would be really welcome. I mean, we had a very, very successful, I know Karen's watching this, seeing that we behave, and Karen was instrumental from the Pestalozzi Trust in putting together with the GHEX a very successful African home education in Dabo last year, which was the first one, and we had the pleasure of hosting Waswa and Godfrey, and Liz unfortunately wasn't able to join us, so that was a wonderful opportunity and perhaps a groundwork for some of this work going forward. So let's get straight on without further ado into some questions and some Q&A. I want to thank all of my presenters again who've been very disciplined with time. So we have some time for Q&A. Just picking up on a couple of themes to start, and please, we'll ask anyone who's participating, please to ask your questions. We've got a few that have been sent to us before, and we've got some questions in the chat box or the Q&A, but please put your questions in now. This is your time to engage with this very eminent panel. I don't want to give anyone's age away, but we could say possibly hundreds of years of home education experience. So just going back to something, starting maybe with something that Godfrey raised and working back a little bit. Godfrey spoke about getting a critical mass, about using from that critical mass getting likely converts, and Waswa, you spoke about defining the narrative. And then we've had quite a bit of insight into trends And what are the trends? What are the current trends? What are the current, let's try and make this a really concrete kind of discussion. If we look at some of these trends that we're seeing at the moment, Waswa, you mentioned the difficulty that government has in adapting to changing circumstances. We know about, we also, in Africa, there's a huge debate about decolonializing the curriculum. There's the challenge of the fourth industrial revolution. How do we as home educators use these trends to create, to reframe the narrative or define the narrative so that we can achieve a critical mass and make converts and support, and not just converts perhaps to home education, but also supporters of our initiatives, and use that to gain more traction with our governments, which, as Bouwe has pointed out, are often fragile governments with constrained resources. So, I mean, that's a question for everyone. Anyone who'd like to jump in on that and share some thoughts.
Can
Godfrey,
I jump in?
please go ahead.
Let me jump in here because in about 20 minutes, I'll be leaving the platform to go to another workshop I'm part of. I'm thinking that one of the things, I know there are so many people who are homeschooling for various reasons, but again, with the little studies we have done, we've discovered that there are some constituencies we can count on that this is where most homeschoolers seem to be coming from at the moment. And I want to say at the moment in Africa, but also even in the United States, it seems to be the same, that there are so many people who are homeschooling because of their faith, and that is because they are Christians. Now, if you happen to come from that constituency, I believe that we have an opportunity there to build upon that presence of few people who are homeschooling in churches, because the church is this kind of group that seems to be organized at the moment, that if we make it a target group for us, that let's target to sensitize these people who already gather together every week and maybe engage the pastors or their leaders to see that we are able to bring word to these people about homeschooling. And incidentally, when you look at the philosophical reasons as to why those who are homeschooling from a Christian perspective do it, their faith seems to be that it supports it largely. It's a biblical mandate for them to homeschool. Those who homeschool from a Christian perspective, they look at it as a discipleship aspect of their call from their God. So if we ride on that and we sensitize, let's say, Christians, in Uganda, if I may use an example, statistics give us 85% Christian, we are a Christian nation. That means 85% of Ugandans go to a church somewhere to listen to what is being taught, to listen to their pastors or their preachers. How about if we begin to target these church leaders and begin to remind them about their role in the education of the nation and how this is a call on them from their God? We would easily find ourselves getting a critical mass of people that politicians will not resist to listen to.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, yes, please. Thanks, Bouwe. Jump in there.
Yeah, I struggle with, I've been struggling with that thing that you're talking about, Godfrey. Is in South Africa, my experience is the churches are not interested in home education. Despite all the good things you say, they're not interested. And then I went to the GHCC in Rio, and I heard Irina Shamulina, I think, the people from Russia. And I heard that the Russian church is very positive about home education. I asked about why is the Russian church so positive about home education, but the churches that I've been dealing with is not. And there seems to be a theological reason why some churches are positive and some churches are negative. And I think maybe we must have a bit of I think we're not going to sort this out on this platform, but maybe have a discussion of Christian homeschoolers and get to understand the theological reasons for why some churches accepting it and not accepting it, and maybe then working out counter arguments.
Well,
Can I say
So I
something?
can chip in.
okay, go ahead,
Please.
Is it me? Here in Namibia, there's compliance requirements from the government with regards to churches. So whenever I've engaged in conversations with the churches that I'm involved in, they're very keen and they want support, and they would support it, but with no voice, if I can put it like that. In other words, they would support it, but they will not link their name to it or anything like that. More with regard, I would say it's a fear, but I don't want to say that because it's a church, they can't be afraid of anything. But because they are scared of the government closing them down, which has happened in our country. So I think in terms of that, if it boils down to a church being closed just because of their educational viewpoint, they would put that at the bottom of the list to regard. I think missionary churches would have a larger effect with regards to that, and that may be a good place to start. But other than that, the bureaucracy of that would be difficult to gauge.
And I think that's not necessarily maybe the same phenomena, but certainly in South Africa we have this. We have a commission that's looking at trying to register churches because of some perceived abuses, and of course once regulation starts, people then often become fearful. So thank you. That's an interesting insight there. Anyone else on the question? Canute, perhaps you have some. Well, our good friend Waswa, you have something to add?
Yes. Kenya's context is very interesting because, number one, in Kenya, historically, the indigenous church has been part of the schooling conversation from pre-colonial times. In fact, after World War II, we had what you called the independent Karinga schools, which was started by indigenous churches as a form of resistance to formal schooling. Now, the second thing is the church in Kenya it's not really what I would call, it's not a theological persuasion per se. It is a very strong and powerful brand. So when the people from McDonnell's land wanted to introduce comprehensive sex education in Kenya, all we did was to get the Catholic bishop and the Anglican bishop to appear on national TV wearing their purple collars, and the government backed down. And it is because between these two, they almost hold sway to half the schools in this country. And so if they say this will not pass, then it will not pass. So as homeschoolers, what we have found ourselves doing is riding behind the wave of this big brother. So the big brother will get scratched as he goes over the fence, then we'll get to the other side and say, Fuchs, how do you pick up things from here? And when you consider that in Kenya, 60% of our population is below 30, 50% of our population is below 15. So when I look at all this panel, we are minorities in this continent. And when politicians, when they look at that, they see votes. And education is emotional before it's rational. So anything that touches my children, I'm going to ask what is happening here. And so in a sense, defining that narrative is a very interesting dance. Maybe Bouwe, who went to Brazil, you can teach us how tango is done so that we can just dance and move along as, as we figure this narrative out. Yeah.
So thank you, Waswa. And listen, stop attacking my panel, please. And I can promote the fact that there is actually, and we do have some alumni on one of the streams in the conference. So you can go there to see some of the younger generation that you want to see. And I think we have got substantial African presence from there, because we've actually got one of the members of the Liberty and Learning Coalition is the Alumni Association of South Africa. You make us feel old. So we were talking, I suppose, if you talk about churches, we're talking about death to some extent. And then we've also got a question here about that other inevitable thing, which is taxes. Badili Experience, who actually, I must say, one of the other comments raised something I talked about yesterday, which was chewing gum and walking at the same time. But he asks, or he or she asks, what happens to our taxes? Shouldn't the government play a role as a partner in education through tax that we are already paying? How can we engage the government from that perspective? Mike, I know, who is also listening in, Mike Donnelly was saying that it's something that the HSLDA has not supported. I know that we've had a lot of debate about this in South Africa, but often resource constraints are a real constraint in Africa. What are people's views about, and I'm assuming the question goes really to the issue of some form of subsidy or assistance for home education. What are people's views in the African context? Is that a wise route to go? What are your thoughts? Bouwe, maybe I can ask you to kick it off. I know you've got some firm views on this from perhaps a libertarian perspective, and we can hear everyone else chipping in after that.
Yeah, I think I'm generally negative about getting some kind of tax relief for home education, because with money comes control. So if you want freedom, you must be willing to sacrifice the money. But in Africa, I don't think that's such a big problem, because as I indicated, most of the South African governments are very poor and have got a shortage of money. So we in South Africa often run the narrative of, listen, home education is already saving you billions of rands. If you give more freedom for people to home educate, then you can, you've got more money to spend on your public schools, and you can offer a better education through, or improve your public school education. And then maybe one day in the future, the public schools will be so good because the homeschoolers have saved you all that money that the homeschoolers will go back to the public school.
I'd like
Shirley,
to add
from another. Oh, sorry, Liz, please. You have
go ahead. No, I was going to add something different. So, okay, sure. Yeah, I was just thinking that, totally in that same train of thought that, with funding comes control. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why those who discourage that would say we don't want then the government to dictate how we use the funds and what we must teach to our children. But, just thinking about other models I've seen working in Kenya, and perhaps in other places in Africa, we can hear if that works, the kind of a cooperative model where people pool resources towards a common cause. And that has been very effective in certain communities for a vision that is owned by the community. And I think this goes into what we were talking about, community awareness, just letting people into the story of homeschooling and understanding what that is. And if we looked at it in a community model, I know on Thursday we'll be discussing some of the models that are relevant to Africa for home education. But if in a certain community people embrace the idea, then we begin looking at, so what does it take for these families in this community to home educate? Perhaps we need a library, perhaps we need some training, perhaps we need, whatever resources there are. And once people have identified with a vision, then the pulling together of resources to bring about that desired change has been one that I've found to work absolutely in a phenomenal way in Kenya. And communities have been able to achieve so much in other areas. So why not in home education?
Thank you, Liz. That's a very exciting initiative. And I think it relates to that theme that we've raised throughout this about how home education and education in general in Africa is often communitarian in its outlook. And I think we're looking forward, and hopefully we'll all have time to attend that session, which I think is going to be very exciting and is coming up. So please, for people who are interested in this topic, please make sure that you go to the website and check out and register for that talk, which I think is going to be quite revolutionary and eye-opening. Shirley, you perhaps if I can call on you, because you've done a lot of research. You've done research into how models work, for example, in New Zealand, where there is a little bit of government funding for home education, and I think that's the same in Australia. So Shirley, I don't know if you want to talk on that topic, but let me give you the open mic if you want to speak on that issue.
Thank you. Yes, as Liberty and Learning Coalition, we decided to do a little bit of digging about how home education works in other countries and other models in our search to find some solutions. And in New Zealand, children are required to be home educated as regularly as, and I think the wording is something like as much as children in school. There's just two phrases that are required. And they do have to register, but there's a very high rate of compliance and parents do register. And what happens is you submit your application form, you have to wait for it to be approved. And then every 6 months, you just get sent a form saying, is this child and this child still being home educated? And the parent says yes. And then the government pays them that stipend twice a year. And there's no monitoring or assessment unless somebody makes a complaint and thinks that some child is not properly being educated. So it seems, people seem to like that in New Zealand, and it seems to work, and they seem to have a very high compliance rate, but possibly it's because the regulations aren't so restrictive or prescriptive as what's proposed, like in South Africa, as in comparison. But yes, I can remember somebody saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune, and that little phrase stuck in my head. So again, it's that thing about the control.
Right. Okay. And I think we've had some comments about that in the side. I think echoing some of the comments Mike made yesterday. And Mike raises an interesting point. He talks about there being tax credits, the HSLDA supporting tax credits as a kind of non-interventionist way of some support for parents. And I think it's interesting with what Liz says, because I think that could also, in an African context, where perhaps there are a lot of people not paying, who aren't in a position to pay tax, but where people can work together, and perhaps we can have a kind of solid, where community projects that could benefit all people who are receiving education, whether they be home educators, low-fee independent schools, cottage schools, government schools, where there could be resources that everyone could have access to, and perhaps that's a way that we work around and negotiate some of these things. Let me ask then for anyone who's got some questions. This is your opportunity. This is your opportunity to raise any further questions as we move towards the end of the session. I have put up in the chat, because my kind panelists have volunteered to do this, I have put up the GHEX Facebook page links, and if you want to continue this discussion there, I think we'll all be monitoring it, and we'll be available to speak and take some of these discussions further. 2 hours is a long time, but also actually a very short time to cover something as diverse as Africa, and such a challenging and exciting topic, which I've certainly found very exciting. So I don't know if I would like to give people an opportunity to ask one or two last questions, and while I'm waiting for that, perhaps a couple of closing remarks, and then we'll get ready to close the session. So if anyone would like to make a closing remark.
Yeah, I must say this session, as well as our preparatory session Friday, was very thought-provoking and inspiring to me. So I sincerely hope that this is not the end of the African discussion, and that there will be some mechanism where the sort of the Pan-African discussion can continue.
I think what's been very interesting to me is to see how just the few countries we have represented here tonight are at different stages of maturity as a homeschooling movement. And I think it would be lovely to see new countries coming on board, and, you know, older leaders, more seasoned leaders can draw them in and support them as they develop home education in other countries of Africa. So I hope anybody from another country watching will maybe just connect with people through the Facebook or emails that are available, and we can grow homeschooling throughout Africa.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shirley. Liz, yes, thank you.
No, just echoing what has been said, that, you know, it would really be great if we can find ways to continue this conversation. And I see Karen putting in the comments that the Africa Home Education Indaba Facebook page would be a good place to begin for that kind of discussion. And, you know, the idea of Indaba having been implemented first last year, and with hopes of being able to have another Indaba next year, hopefully in Kenya, would be a good way for us to connect. And even just hearing the fantastic work you're doing, Shirley, with the Liberty for Learning, I think those would be great forums for us to know what else is happening in the continent and how can we plug in, how can we continue this very rich discussion.
Thank you, Liz. And can I perhaps get a last word from Mari and from Waswa?
Ladies first.
Thank you, Waswa. Such a gentleman. I would just like to thank you guys. I've learned so much just by watching and sharing on Saturday or Friday as well, and just, you know, hearing your insights and knowing that even though it's a young country in terms of education, there's support in terms of a very rich and wealthy knowledge base, and the fact that we can tap into that. And that excites me, and I'm so excited about, you know, sharing with you some of the other African countries that I've engaged with in the last 3 weeks, because I had the opportunity to join a global prayer group, and we are actually gaining a lot of countries in Africa. So that's so exciting. So I definitely would love for us to get together. Liz is also there, and Canute and Godfrey. And I mean, just the fact that that has grown in such a tremendous way over the last 3 weeks shows me that this is the time for something like this to happen. So I'm very excited, and I'd love to be a part of a coalition for Africa.
Yes. Yeah, my final comment would be our situation in Kenya when it comes to political engagement is the government sees us as a bourgeoisie entity. You know, these guys who speak English and policy and psychology of education. And really, as we said, when you understand how government works, every government process is backed up by legislation. A legislative process is a political process first. You are too few and you speak too much English for them to care about you politically. But but I think that gives us the perfect platform. So we can just get a Trojan approach, get in there, get into government think tanks. In fact, when I look at the homeschool leadership of each representation in government outfits that inform policy, we are punching way, way above our weight. And so I think that is one way we can use the Trojan approach to be able to influence government at that level. So I'm seeing very bright things ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Waswa. Thank you. And thank you to the panel. I think we've today proved two things. One is that, to quote the 2010 World Cup, this time for Africa. And also we spoke about church. And so I think one of the church fathers, I think it's Origin, said, always a new thing coming out of Africa. I think that was sometimes about lack of orthodoxy, but today we've had some unorthodox, some orthodox thoughts, and and I hope have informed the rest of the world and invited them into our continent to see how we meet these challenges. And we're looking forward to interacting with all of you, people in Africa, people from outside Africa, to learn from you and hopefully for you to learn from us. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful session. So as we close our time, I just want to have a couple of things. We've got quite a number of Facebook groups and Facebook pages listed in the chat. Please go there and get those before the chat disappears. Also watch this recording. So as we close our time together, I want to thank all of our speakers, Liz, Bouwe, Waswa, Marié, Godfrey, and Shirley for their thoughtful comments. Thank you for choosing to invest your time to the audience with this in this session. And as a reminder, this session is recorded and will be available in the future. To learn more about the GHEX and to support our mission, and particularly in Africa, please visit www.ghx.world. I think even Mike was surprised to find how many young people we have in Kenya. Indeed, homeschooling is a global movement and a global solution, and also an area in which Africa can lead. So thank you for being part of today's session, which was about making the most out of political engagement in the African context. I hope it's been a practical workshop. So thank you very much again, and thank you, and goodbye, good night, good afternoon, and now the session is ended. Goodbye.
Bye.